Well, I didn't think there was anything hotter than gossip, but this next presentation may convince us otherwise. It's my pleasure to be the guest host, at least for a few minutes, of this event. And our next presenter is a reminder to us that every year in our student body, we have a good representation of other traditions besides the big three of the founding churches. Rob Jeffery is from the Salvation Army tradition, and he tells me he has no title, but the gossip says otherwise. Nonetheless, he's a good soldier in that tradition, and indeed, I think you'll learn a lot about the Salvation Army in this presentation, and also a lot about preaching. So I ask you now to help welcome our next presenter, Rob Jeffery, who will deal with the topic, hot topic, the impact of preaching on Salvation Army members. Rob.
John Astley was asked why so many people came to hear him preach. His response was, "When you set yourself on fire, people love to come and see you burn." William and Catherine Booth, themselves born out of the Methodist tradition, picked up the cooling embers of a Wesleyan homiletic and fanned the flames again, becoming the first preachers in a small East End London mission that eventually became the worldwide Salvation Army. Having grown up in the Salvation Army, I have heard some hot preaching. I remember hot summer nights at the Sunday night service, the bass drum thumping, the brass band shining, and the preacher blazing forth a red-hot sermon. Ever the good junior soldier, I would invite my friends from school to come and attend Sunday school at the Salvation Army. Their usual reply being, "You go to church in a thrift store?" But I remember men and women preachers whose sermons would ignite the fire in my young soul and in the souls of the people around me. After hearing a heart-wrought, passionate message that brought men and women forward to the mercy seat, seeking salvation and sanctification, I remember a feeling growing in me that part of my life, or perhaps all of it, would one day be spent doing the same thing. And yet in that brief span of time between 7 years and 32, I have witnessed a great cooling towards preaching. No longer is the preacher's word the final word on anything. There have been moments in my own denomination when I have wondered if the sermon is dead, not due to any lack of trying by the officer preacher, but simply by the response of the people hearing the word. Was it moving them? Was it inspiring them to live out their faith in God's kingdom that is here, in God's kingdom that is now? I didn't know. I didn't know if preaching was having an effect on anyone, either the preacher that was preaching or the people who were listening. I wanted to find out if sermons were having an impact, and if not, what could be done to make them more impactful. What could be done to reignite the Salvation Army homiletic so that once more our army pulpits would be the source of hot preaching in a cold postmodern world that desperately needs to be warmed up. This has led me to my research question: how does preaching impact Salvation Army congregations and contribute to their spiritual formation? My research goals were simple: to discover some of the impacts, if any, preaching was having at a congregational level. As I look back at my life, I knew that I had been spiritually formed by the spoken words, but of others. Would my research help uncover the reasons why some sermons have little to no impact, and why others, thankfully, have a great impact that stay with the listener for a day, for 2 days, for 7 days, for 7 years? I sure hope so. My research was grounded narrative in its methodology. I invited 4 Salvationists to complete a 10-question interview. Jane was a soldier of the Salvation Army, someone who has taken on the Soldier's Covenant and leads children's ministries in her local corps. Matthew was a Salvation Army officer who preached many sermons in the past as a minister in charge of a church. And now he serves in administration, and where he hears more sermons than he gives. Mark is an adherent member, someone who is committed to making the army their church home, but has not taken on the requirements of the soldier's covenant. While Monica, having been brought up in the army, has recently returned to a life of faith. Hearing sermons on a regular basis was a new thing for her. To get a perspective on preaching from a long-serving soldier, an officer preacher, an adherent member, and a new Christian was an amazing opportunity to hear 4 diverse perspectives on preaching. In addition to the interviews, I invited 50 Salvationists to respond to a 10-question survey on SurveyMonkey, answering to what extent they agreed with 10 different statements on preaching. The interview questions and the survey statements were the same in most cases, though the wording was changed in the surveys to elicit more defined answers. The interviews and the surveys gave me some wonderful information to help answer my research question. In order to give you a theological framework for my topic, you must understand that the Salvation Army is a religious movement birthed from the Methodist Church that is thoroughly Wesleyan Arminian in its theology and practice. It found its preaching voice not in the hallowed walls of a parish church or cathedral, but in the open air, where Salvation Army officers or clergy proclaim the gospel amidst the din and the clamor of the streets. What won the hearts of the crowds over was not a clever homily or a theologically deep expository sermon, but a simple message that was delivered in a fashion characterized by Princeton scholar Diane Winston as red hot and righteous. Back then as today, theologians have attempted to identify what a sermon is and what a sermon does when it is proclaimed from the pulpit to the pew. In Dietrich Bonhoeffer's view, the proclaimed word is the incarnate Christ himself. He says the preached Christ is both the historical one and the present one. Therefore, the proclaimed word is not a medium of expression for something else, something which lies behind it, but rather it is the Christ himself, walking through the congregation as the Word. Rudolf Bultmann spoke of the kerygma, or preaching, as the seminal event in which the believer participates in the life of Christ. He said the relation between the saving act of God in us and the historical cross of Jesus is that of part to whole, a first act to an entire drama which continues each time that a person hearing the sermon makes the decision to be crucified with Christ. While there's no formal statement in Salvation Army theology that says the sermon is Christ in quite the same way that Bultmann and Bonhoeffer have expressed it, in the experience of Salvation Army preaching, Christ is present in the sermon. One eyewitness, speaking of a sermon preached by the co-founder of the Salvation Army, said, "Above them all, to my mind, stands Catherine Booth. I cannot exactly describe the secret of the extraordinary, captivating power of her words, but her address remains unforgettable. Right from the beginning to the end, she brought me into the presence of Christ." In the words of the sermon, people can experience the Word of God. The sermon spiritually forms both preacher and listener, and as such brings the faithful into the very presence of Christ. This is the role and function of the sermon in the Salvation Army. So to share with you my main themes from my research. My research has shown that preaching does have an impact on Salvation Army congregations. Preaching does contribute to a Salvationist spiritual formation. 2 of my 4 interviewees said that preaching was the most important part of a Sunday service. And a majority of my survey respondents said the same thing. You know, it is natural for a preacher to wonder whether his or her sermons are forgotten the moment they are spoken, the moment the service is over. But every participant could remember at least one memorable sermon that has stayed with them for many years. This excited me. Just as Christ's words, his sermons, if you will, were remembered by his followers long before they were written down, our ability to remember the spoken word sometimes years after the sermon event shows that as Christians we are hardwired into the oral tradition that so characterized the early church. So while not every sermon is memorable, there are some that have a lasting impact years after they are preached. Another key finding that one question fleshed out is the ability for a sermon to inspire right action. Hot preaching inspires Salvationists to go into the world and to serve God by serving others. The 2 S's on the soldier's uniform, saved to serve, embody this theology. Sometimes, however, good action or right behavior speaks of the way that we relate to other people. Monica and Jane spoke of a sermon that inspired them to forgive someone that had wronged them, and to treat someone nicer that they had been treating poorly, and to ask forgiveness of someone that they had wronged. Now, when you think about that, let us not downplay the significance of the transformation that occurred in the souls of my interviewees who expressed the change, the power of a sermon to do that. Monica recalled an unflinching, unapologetic sermon on Matthew 6:15, where the possibility of not forgiving someone who had wronged her, in her mind, put her in jeopardy of not receiving God's forgiveness. The urgency to go out and to achieve reconciliation between offending parties is the result of hot preaching, and also speaks to the sermon's ability to spiritually form the life of the listener. Salvation Army sermons are based on the Bible, and indeed there remains a strong desire for Salvationists to keep hearing biblical sermons. The hermeneutical approach to interpreting the Bible that Salvation Army preachers employ is highly varied. But Matthew, without using these exact words, spoke of the need for a sermon to interpret the Bible by examining the worlds in, behind, and before the biblical text. Salvationists want biblical preaching that is relevant to them. They want to be confronted with a gospel that intersects with their life and their culture. Matthew and Mark both spoke of the need for officer preachers to be in tune with God and with their communities. Theirs was the experience of theologian Karl Barth, who said, "We still need, according to my old formulation, the Bible and the newspaper." In order for an impactful sermon to speak to a Salvationist sitz in Leben or situation in life, it must be presented in a clear, concise, and meaningful way. And I discovered from my research that the way a sermon is preached and presented from the pulpit does matter. Jane spoke of an impactful sermon she heard where the preacher used an illustration from the hit reality TV show Keeping Up with the Kardashians. You can tell there's some fans here. Rather than the show being used to illustrate something negative, the show was used in an interesting way to highlight the popularity of Jesus during his early earthly ministry. The listener, Jane, thought that the preacher was going to speak poorly of the illustration, to speak poorly of the TV show, but was surprised when it turned out to be a positive point of comparison that made her think more deeply of the fickleness of public opinion. Jane highlights the needs for sermons to make people think. Worship is better when it engages the mind. Jane said, "Whenever someone makes a point that is opposite of what you think they're going to do, it makes you think more. And when the congregation is thinking, then more effective things are happening in the worship." I really like that last quote. When the congregation is thinking, then more effective things are happening in the worship. And I found this theme peppered throughout my interviews. The presentation of the sermon is more than just what a preacher does with her hands, or how many times the preacher looks at his notes. The presentation is as important as the content. If Christ is being presented in the sermon should be presented as one that seeks to bring people into the life of God. Jane and Matthew recalled hearing turn or burn style sermons growing up in the Salvation Army. These sermons were presented more like hammers than invitations to participate in the divine life. In my research, I discovered that such a homiletic, such a way of preaching, was not native to the Salvation Army. Remember my quote about Catherine Booth's preaching that made the listener feel that he had encountered the risen Christ through her speaking? Themes of judgment were present in the early Army homiletic, make no mistake. While Army preachers solicited their listeners to reflect on the coming judgment, the theme of judgment was held in tension with the theme of grace. Preaching Christ and the hope that Christ brings is more a hallmark of traditional Army preaching than turn or burn style messages, which I believe came about through the rise of fundamentalism and its initial impact on all of our mainline churches. As Mark said about the sermons that he found the most impactful, "Inspire me, touch my heart, but don't manipulate me." Another theme I explored in my research is the preacher's relationship with the mercy seat. The mercy seat or altar is a prayer bench at the front of every Salvation Army church. Its place just under the pulpit shows its connection to the sermon. At the end of every sermon, the preacher calls people forward to pray at the mercy seat. Traditionally, the call to the mercy seat signified repentance. It signified conversion and sanctification. All four interviewees expressed an appreciation of the mercy seat as a tradition of the Salvation Army. But all four expressed a sense of ambiguity and a sense of discomfort of how it was connected with the sermon. Sometimes it was the experience of the participants that the preacher connected the call to the mercy seat with the sermon in a very good way, and people would come forward to receive the grace of God. And in a church that doesn't do communion quite like the other churches, the mercy seat for us is an outward sign of an invisible grace. But other times it was noted the connection between sermon and the mercy seat was disjointed. A clumsy call for believers to come forward tagged on to the end of the sermon, for some negates any power that the spoken word might have affected in the life of the listener. Preachers should think carefully on how they make the call to the mercy seat at the end of a sermon. If any of my research is generalizable, then there are a growing number of Salvationists who aren't quite sure what to make of their long-treasured mercy seat. Of great import is my final theme on the impact of sermons in the Salvation Army and how they contribute to a Salvationist spiritual formation. Sermons that have the most impact are the ones where the preacher is convinced of the truth of the message that he or she is proclaiming. An impactful sermon comes from an impactful preacher whose life bears authentic witness to the crucified and resurrected Christ. Jane and Mark both spoke of memorable sermons where the life-giving truths of the gospel were being passionately defended by the preacher. You could see it in his face that he believed what he was saying, said Jane. These are the hallmarks of impactful preaching. While it is good news that preaching does have an impact on Salvation Army congregations and that it does contribute to their spiritual formation, the Salvation Army sermon is far from being in a safe place. And I would say further that the sermons in the majority of Canada's mainline churches are far from being in a safe place. Scratch that, actually. Perhaps they are in a safe place, and that is part of the problem. How do we fashion our homiletic to withstand the rigors of a postmodern world that is largely cooled to the idea of preaching? Michael Quick observed that in too many places, preaching has been reduced to an anemic religious non-event. Faint is its power to proclaim an alternative reality, the kingdom of God, and faint is its conviction about transforming communities. The sermon, I believe, is just too important to fail. But equally so, the sermon is too important to be stuck mired in a tradition that fails to project relevance to contemporary expression. Major Dr. Julie Sluice says that the Salvation Army can no longer rest on the merits of finger-pointing, guns-loaded, sock-it-to-him kind of preaching. Rather, the you need to, we need to imperatives of preaching now need to be balanced with a stronger assertion of you can, we can claims, which ultimately point to the saving power of God to breathe new life into old wineskins. This is the so what, breathing new life into old wineskins. This is what the Salvation Army sermon must do to reach the people of today. This new hope for a revised Salvation Army homiletic that brings forward the best from the tradition while fulfilling our Wesleyan mandate to serve the present age is preaching that impacts the listener by showing, not compelling, by leading, not pushing, and by revealing, not blinding. William Booth, in speaking of the Army service, said, "What good is a meeting if it isn't hot? Hot preaching burns away despondency. Hot preaching burns away despair. Hot preaching burns away the fatalistic outlook that the world is the way it is and evermore shall be. Hot preaching energizes towards hope while keeping vital focus on salvation as the way for human beings to participate in the life of God." Jane and Mark spoke of the need for preaching to surprise them, to take them in new and unexpected directions. The expository style of preaching that makes 1.3 times is no longer surprising, is no longer fresh. It is no longer what is needed. One method of preaching that two interviewees found particularly impactful is a sermon delivered in 3 modes of experience: orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. The first part of the sermon orients the listener to a surface-level reading of the biblical text. Like how the sermon that Jane experienced on Jesus' popularity would orient the listener to those scenes of biblical scenes of people crowding in around Jesus. As Jane experienced, the disorientation came when the preacher referenced the Kardashians, not the most likely illustration for a sermon, but one that surprised her because it wasn't what she expected. This moment of confusion and disorientation allowed her to be reoriented by the gospel that was brought out of the biblical text when the preacher said that our faith can sometimes be like those fickle crowds that follow Jesus from one miracle to another. But discipleship, true discipleship, means something more. It means picking up one's cross daily and following. Orient, disorient, reorient is a way of preaching that is uniquely suited to this age and culture. This has implications for the Salvation Army sermon, and I would suggest for sermons in most Canadian churches. Thomas Long offers a pictorial definition of 21st century preaching that all Salvation Army preachers would do well to grab hold of. Imagine, he says, that the biblical text for next Sunday's sermon is not a piece of literature, but a deep and mysterious cave. The preacher is the trained explorer of caves who descends into this one, flashlight and ropes in hand, filled with excitement and discovery. Others have explained this cave before. Indeed, the preacher has read all of their accounts, studied their maps, been excited by the sights they have seen, marveled at the treasures they have discovered, and is impelled by their assurance that there is yet new treasures to be found. The preacher must move even deeper into the cave. Suddenly, he turns a corner, and there it is, what he has been looking for all along. He stands before the sight in a moment of awe and silence. Then, knowing what he must do, he carefully retraces his path, scrambles to the mouth of the cave, and with the dirt of the journey still on his fingers, and his flashlight in hand, waving excitedly, he calls to those who had been waiting for him. Come on, have I got something to show you? Hot preaching will continue to warm the hearts of an entirely new generation of Salvationists. Come on, Salvationists, have I got something to show you? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob. That's really good insights and good inspiration, it seems. We do have time for questions. Please keep your sermons to less than a half an hour.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You talked a lot about the need to reinvent sometimes, that making the 3 points 3 times has gone away, and people need to be surprised. I'm wondering, where's the line between engaging and entertaining, and where's the line between congregation and audience? Do you know what I mean? At what point are we putting on a show? That's the concern that I have.
Well, indeed, that's one of my concerns for preaching as well. Perhaps in your church as well, there's a tendency to rely on extra sources from outside of your tradition. There's a lot of YouTube videos being shown in churches today. There's a lot of other stuff out there. Some of it is good, some of it perhaps is questionable. But I think Salvation Army preaching, or a preaching style that helps encourage the faith of the congregation, that speaks to their need and their situation, will always be relevant and will be distinguishable from more entertainment style of preaching that might not be what we should be striving for.
I just wanted to touch on, I wanted to understand if any of your respondents touched on the intersection between the who does the preaching as opposed to the how and the what. We heard a lot in your presentation about the how and the what, but I'm interested in the who. Just by a really quick example, I heard a sermon once by a Salvation Army officer who was preaching about incarnational ministry. What I knew about her was that she'd founded the Army's work in Russia, and that when she was about to deliver her first child, the Army said to her, "We'll take you out of here because the healthcare system is not very good. We'll send you somewhere safe to have your baby." And she said, "No, I'm going to stay here because these hospitals are where my people go." And that had a profound effect on my life and where I lived. And so I'm interested in that intersection of who delivers the message as opposed to the how and the what it is they say. What is the importance of that?
That's a good question. And one of my questions did touch on that, although I didn't expand on it in my presentation. But I asked my interviewees a question about how does your relationship with the preacher impact the way you hear his or her sermon? And most people were very honest in saying that if they have a favorable impression of the preacher, they probably will have a favorable impression of the sermon. It would be hard for them to fail, one interviewee said. And yet, as the discussion unfolded, most people were willing to admit that, yes, they could recognize the difference between good preaching and sloppy preaching. And they hoped that if they had a strong relationship with the preacher, if they heard some sloppy preaching or preaching speaking to the nature of your question that wasn't perhaps authentic to the situation going on around them, they would be able to hopefully lovingly challenge them about that. So yes, if you have a favorable view of the preacher, you may likely have a favorable view of her sermons, but only to a certain extent, I think.
Where's Darlene?
Thank you for your presentation. I thought it was beautifully done. And one of the things that always strikes me about the Salvation Army is the beautiful marriage of justice and preaching. And some of the ads that the Salvation Army has are sermons, you know, beautifully done in just a very powerful, evocative way. So I'm just wondering about your research, if you came across a strong link between that sense of justice and being the church in the world and that connection with preaching.
In my research itself, none of my interviewees specifically spoke about justice as being impacted by preaching. Although when I pressed one a little bit, that is exactly what he said. Mark was one of my interviewees, and he's a person that actually works. He's a member of the Salvation Army, but he's also is an employee in our local homeless shelter. And Mark spoke of the way that sermons encourage him to go on in his very hard 9-to-5 work of meeting human need in very difficult situations. So there is definitely that link, and yes, we do see that throughout the Salvation Army, that link between social justice initiatives and a preaching that fuels that.
I was raised in a Wesleyan Arminian tradition, and I remember so well those camp altar calls that we used to have, and how powerful they were after you'd heard this fire and brimstone preaching to come forward and do something. And now I'm in a really progressive liberal church, and people say, and a good preacher as well, and many people say, I don't know what to do with this now. You know, I've heard this. What do I do with it? I wish we could have some conversation or some way of acknowledging or embodying it in some way. So I'm wondering if, when you said they don't know what to do with the mercy seat now, Salvationists, If you put any thought into how we can, in a postmodern world, sort of ritualize or embody a sermon in a way that is as moving as those altar calls were when I was a child.
I think it requires great intentionality on the part of the preacher to link the sermon with the call to come forward to the mercy seat in a powerful and moving way. I think many people in the Salvation Army experience some negativity about the mercy seat because I've heard it expressed, not so much in my interviews, but I've heard it expressed that if they feel led to come forward, and perhaps this relates to Rachel's presentation on gossip, there's a fear that they will be talked about. Why is so-and-so praying at the mercy seat? What's up with them? I don't think that's the experience. I hope it's not. But I think there is some of that trepidation. But I think it requires great intentionality on the part of the preacher and those who in the congregation that influence the service to make the call well to the mercy seat, to connect it powerfully with the sermon. Because I believe it is a sacramental act to come forward to receive God's grace. And Salvationists, I think, have to wrestle with that, how that tradition finds relevance in today.
Thanks, Rob, for a fine presentation and for allowing me to have the experience of hearing a Salvationist quote Rudolph Bultmann. That was wonderful. Well, one thing I would encourage you to do if you want to pursue your study further is to put your findings alongside the Listening Project, which John McClure is the homiletician that's most identified with it, that I don't believe engaged any Salvationists, but did engage across many denominations in about the middle of about 2005. And a couple of things emerging from that resonate to an extent with what you've said. But where homiletics is going today is moving beyond seeing the sermon as an inventive engagement to a process or part of a process of engagement. So the focus is shifting to what kind of relationship is created and what happens in that relationship while the preacher is preaching. And so there's much more emphasis on the partnership between congregants and preacher in a creative act during the sermon time. So my question for you is, given that though much has changed in the Salvation Army in terms of worship, and in terms even of its understanding of itself and using the word church more often than ever before, but to what extent is the relationship between preacher and people while the preacher's preaching still shaped by the hierarchy, symbolic and otherwise, that remains within the Army?
I think it would be similar to other churches that have that level of hierarchy as well. I think of our Roman Catholic brethren. In the Salvation Army, we don't have, believe it or not, we don't have an exalted sense of the clergy. An officer is a soldier that comes from the ranks of Salvation Army membership to lead congregations, to lead social service ministries. I think the officer's work in the community from Monday to Saturday speaks to how he or she defines their relationship with the members of his congregation. And I think in some ways that gets at the reason why perhaps Salvation Army clergy aren't as effective in preaching as I believe they could be. I think of the officers in my home church where I grew up. And in the Salvation Army, they have couples ministry, which is unique and a blessing, but it comes with some challenges as well. But in their little church of probably 60 or so regular attendees, they run that. But in addition to that, they run and manage 2 Salvation Army thrift stores, 2 businesses essentially, which is very demanding. And they also run a Salvation Army community center from Monday to Friday. So they're overseeing all of this, they're managing employees, they're directing volunteers in ways that I think are unique to this tradition, that you won't automatically find outside of this church. So I do think, yeah, to answer your question, that's how they relate to their people. So it's the work from Monday to Saturday that the people would be able to say, yes, I believe this preacher's words are authentic. She is living the words that she preaches. But I also think just the sheer amount of time, the sheer amount of stuff that officers are doing takes away from their much needed time to prepare a sermon.
What I hear you saying then is that there is less of a sense that while the officer is preaching, he or she is assuming a role that is somehow other than what they observe, what the congregation observes the officer doing.
Very much so.
Thanks, Rob. You mentioned that the preaching becomes the Word, and the Word becomes incarnational, that in fact it is Christ among us. How clear was that in your respondents? Was that something that kind of popped out, or was it a nebulous kind of undercurrent?
It was a nebulous, but it did pop out, particularly in one of my interviewees. Mark spoke of the need for preachers to be really authentic, for them to have a faith that is authentic, for him to feel that, yes, what he or she is saying, he is truly transformed by the power of the gospel and by the words of sacred scripture. So yeah, and another interviewee spoke of a sense that she had, that she could tell if perhaps someone was faking it, which was interesting. So I think that came through in the research.
Rob, thanks so much. Lovely presentation, well done. I'm wondering about a physiological concomitant in Salvationist worship, right? So I heard a friend of mine once said that when he's visiting a city, he gets up about 9 o'clock in the morning and hails down a cab and says, "Take me to the church with a drum in it." And he knows he's going to get good preaching. The reason I say that is because in Salvationist tradition, there's already inspiration, and you already have some adrenaline going when the preacher preaches. Unlike some other traditions that really kind of avoid and are frightened to death of adrenaline, but in fact, you do have it going. I mean, you get drums going. So when a preacher preaches, they don't preach into a vacuum. They actually preach into a physiological phenomenon. There's something already animated in them. Could you comment about that?
Yeah. I think when you attend an authentic Salvation Army service, whether it's a big corps, we would call it, or a small corps, there's a huge physical component. When you walk in, every sense is stimulated. As I mentioned in my introduction, if it's chorus time, the beating of the bass drum, that's a tradition, but it still is carried out. People clapping their hands. Salvation Army services can be loud at times. People react physically to the worship that is going on before them. And indeed, in a successful, I hate to use that word, but in a successful mercy seat call, where people do come forward, just that act of kneeling and praying, communing with God, as a member of the congregation, it's very powerful.
How are we doing for time, Susan?
Thank you very much, Rob.
Thank you.
Appreciate your...